in my case, when I'm using IF in teaching, it's not really for the IF. It's not for the interactive fiction at all. It's many ways for the idea of simulating space, and also just to give my students some weird environment that they've never worked in. And in Form, which is what I use, at least in Form 6, is an example of that. It's just something strange and unusual. And it's something unusual that has a historical precedent. In other words, they can understand that this is a format that has actually a commercial life and a historical life, not one I made up that no one's ever used. But they can pick it up in about 2 weeks or less, 2-week project, let's say. IF, not so much as a storytelling medium, even as an expressive medium when you're doing 2 weeks with students, but getting them into something that they haven't seen before that doesn't require them to worry about 3D graphics, 2D graphics. It's an infinite poly count medium, and that's what I liked about it. So we are right now in 2007, so you figure that students in their second year of college were born in the late 80s, 88, 89, something like that, and getting even later. They have no concept of text adventures as a medium. They never encountered them. They certainly don't know about IF in its modern form. They grew up, if they did grow up on video games, it was Super NES, PlayStation kind of generation. So this is unusual. So first thing, of course, I make them play some, and I make them play graphical adventures as well, and we get a sense of what these artifacts are all about. But it's very foreign, and the idea of typing or of understanding commands is something unusual. It's something out of their experience. They don't usually play games or interact with computers in that way. When you program IF, the easiest way to do it is just to use a kind of command line compiler, and even using command line compilers is something I found that students sometimes have trouble with. They've been raised on the GUI and don't know what it is to type things into the computer, right? So it's not just the idea of interacting with the piece, with a text adventure or an interactive fiction artifact, but just the very idea of typing commands into the computer and seeing the results is somehow unfamiliar. So yeah, it's a very foreign medium, which is in part why I like using it. I'm making them write something. I'm making them create a space and then create some kind of experience in that space, right? That's really all I'm asking them to do. I give them 2 weeks. At the start of the 2 weeks, they've never before seen a piece of interactive fiction. They maybe have never played a text adventure. And they've certainly never programmed in Form. And at the end, they have to turn something in. So that's the experience. I would say out of every term that I do it, I see a couple interesting standout approaches. Often there's someone who kind of really groks the idea that space, that rooms or spaces can be used for things other than rooms. So it doesn't have to be the movement through hallways or dungeon-like things or cave-like things, hallways and rooms. I had one student who did a skydiving piece, for example, which was an interesting way to kind of deal with the way that you move through space in IF. But generally, very literal interpretation of sort of movement. And then, there are the students who, whether they've played text adventures or not, have a kind of strong affinity toward fantasy fiction. And when they play Zork, it opens up that kind of interest. And so I often see a lot of that kind of fantasy fiction style pieces in the work the students do. It's not. It's a weird thing to grade, actually. If you imagine you have 40 students or 100 students, and they each turn in a short paper, an essay. You read it, and you make your comments, and you give them a mark, right? But when they give you an IF piece, you have to ask them. I mean, there's no other way to do it. I have to ask them. Tell me the secret, right? Give me the solution, because I can't simply afford to go and try to solve all of these puzzles. Although I do try not to look at that material until I need it, And I'm not trying to get the aesthetics of interactive fiction across, and I don't expect them to grow as IF authors in my course anyway. There's opportunities in other courses that we offer to do that. But in other words, I don't judge them based on how good the puzzle was or how challenging the riddle was. However, I do need to be able to get through it, right? And when you have kind of a lot of branching spaces and many possible interactions with objects and so forth, just the work of taking in the material so I can then pass judgment on it, and if you want to look at it that way, is time consuming. I guess in my experience, the ones I like the most, those that I feel are the most successful, are just very concise, and the kinds of choices are the kinds of choices that I'm expecting to make are at least reasonably obvious to me. So even if I don't play through, I can kind of get a sense of the richness of the experience. I think the one I liked the most in recent terms was one of my students did a piece on a husband being sent to the grocery store late at night to obtain some set of foodstuffs for his pregnant wife, right? And this was I mean, it was funny, and it was a nice setup. It was very specific, but it also really captured the idea of kind of being lost and unaware in a space that was easy to represent, given the affordances of interactive fiction. That's an example of something, a small scale, accomplishable in 2 weeks, really getting a sense of what the medium can do, implementing it in a way that I can understand very rapidly, and so forth, yeah. Having a cultural literacy in text adventures in interactive fiction gives these students, as they go off, hopefully to be kind of the next generation of computer media, designers or creators, it gives them a touch point, and they may think, oh, this is a problem that I could solve with a text parser. Maybe this is a problem that a text parser makes sense to use for, and I know that because I had this experience with IF. Or something else that might be unexpected. That I think is why you go to school. That's why you encounter things that are not kind of commercially viable necessarily, or culturally accepted as a kind of wide form. And I think that's fine. But the students are uncomfortable. Certainly, they don't like text adventures, interactive fiction for the most part. Every now and then I have students who really fall in love with it and they pursue it. But by and large, they don't like it. They don't like Zork, and frankly, they don't like Myst even. They don't seem to like this kind of medium. And I think a lot of it is just because it's unfamiliar. Now, when I catch up with them later in their undergraduate careers, they may have warmed up to some of this. It's almost the reaction of, I don't know what's going on here, and why are you giving me this, this Greek poetry or this, this 17th century English literature? I don't know what to do with it. I think that's the experience they're having with IF. In current trends, especially in kind of game design education or game development education, there's a focus on tools, a focus on kind of the current generation of hardware systems, a focus on graphics, just because the industry has been so focused on graphics. So when I strip that out, it not only relieves the students and me of the pressure of having to deal with the nuts and bolts of programming some system just to get something on the screen, but also it tears that away from them. It takes away from them the one convention that they're familiar with, which is kind of objects moving around, computer graphics. So those are some of the reasons why I chose interactive fiction as one of those examples of environments that I want my students to work in. In my program, there's a strong interest in computational narrative, or so-called interactive narrative, or any of the many names that you can give to that kind of attempt to render narrative inside computer media. And so this is also a way to help students figure out if that's something they're really interested in. If there's a student who really is interested in writing and who really is interested in interactivity and programming and computer media, then they may find that that's a thread they want to pursue, and now they've had a 2-week-long experience to help them get there. But if it isn't something they want to pursue, then it's just another bit of flavoring in their education. It seemed to me, maybe I'm wrong about this, that the Inform community was sort of a more supportive community. In other words, if a student wanted to pursue this later, I think there are more resources for them to pursue Inform. I started teaching Inform largely because I know how to use Inform, and I didn't have to go and learn something else. But also, I started teaching it because I wanted them to write code, and I didn't want to, I didn't want to do a graphical, like adventure game toolkit, for example. That wasn't something I wanted to do. And I liked Inform because it had certain hooks into kind of, object-oriented programming concepts that they're learning elsewhere, but it wasn't kind of using that as doctrine, right? Inform is weird enough, but is also similar enough to other kinds of coding that I felt like it gave them this sort of different perspective on something familiar. But I started teaching Inform before Inform 7 was released, and of course Inform 7 has this very different method of authorship where you're kind of using natural language to describe the world and the interactions in it rather than coding the world up itself. And I haven't yet switched over. I don't know how I feel about it because I kind of lose that connection to the code when I go to Inform 7, or I feel like I might, and I haven't yet come to grips with what I want to do about it. I like the idea that the authorship of interactive fiction is abstracted from the process of writing. So there's writing in IF. If you can't write well, then you're not destined to be a good IF author. There's writing involved. But then there's also programming involved, and I feel like bringing the two together in their kind of natural habitats, if you will. There's some very interesting features of Inform 7. The idea that the source code, if you want to call it that, right, is describing the output. Like there's this kind of double-coded relationship between the code and the world that you create. The kind of expressive nature of the piece itself is tied to the source code for the piece. That's something I actually talk about later in the class in a different context, in the context of sort of esoteric programming languages. So I've thought about going back to Inform 7 after we've done Inform 6 in that context. I don't have a kind of moral objection to it, but I'm not yet comfortable using it myself, and for that reason I haven't been able to use it in my classes.